The blue gas giant filled half the sky over Avenir. Its slow storms turned in silence, painting the small moon in shades of soft cobalt and pale gold. The colony below was quiet at this hour. The academy bells had rung 2 hours ago, and 416 children were asleep in the long dormitories that lined the central garden. Headmaster Edrin walked the outer path with his hands folded behind his back. He had walked this same path every night for 12 years. He liked the way the gravel sounded under his boots. He liked the way the dorm windows glowed warm and yellow against the dark moonscape. He told himself, as he often did, that this was the safest place in human space. A school, a garden, children from 20 worlds learning each other's languages. The freighter that drifted into low orbit at 2300 hours broadcast a routine supply code. The traffic officer on duty logged it without a second glance. Avenir received 40 such freighters a week. Food, books, lab equipment, replacement parts for the old water systems. The officer poured himself another cup of synth tea and turned back to the documentary, playing on his small screen. The freighter doors opened in vacuum. 40 figures in matte black armor dropped onto the colony's loading platform without making a sound. They moved with the calm of soldiers who had practiced this exact route for months. They knew where the cameras were. They knew where the night staff slept. They knew which dormitory held the youngest children and which held the oldest. The first teacher to die was a woman named Hala, who had stepped outside for a cigarette. She did not see the figure behind her. She did not have time to call out. The second was a man named Bren, who heard a sound in the hallway and came to investigate. The third was Headmaster Edrin himself, who walked back toward the main building wondering why the path lights had suddenly gone dark. Inside the dormitories, the children were lifted from their beds while still asleep. The armored figures worked in pairs, one to carry, one to watch. Small bodies were wrapped in soft gray cloth and moved in silence down the long corridors. A few of the older children woke and saw shapes in the dark. One boy, 12 years old, tried to run. He was caught at the doorway and held until he stopped struggling. He was not hurt. None of them were hurt. The orders had been clear. The children were valuable. The children were the point. By the time the colony's emergency systems registered that something was wrong, the loading platform was empty. The freighter was already lifting. Its engines pushed it past the orbit of the gas giant and into the long dark beyond. The traffic officer, finally noticing the alert on his screen, stood up too fast and knocked over his synth tea. He stared at the empty space where the freighter had been. He picked up the emergency line and his hand was shaking. The first message reached Earth 6 hours later, traveling through the relay network at the speed of light and the slower speed of human shock. It arrived at the Office of Colonial Affairs at 4 in the morning, local time. A junior officer read it twice before she understood what it said. Then she read it a third time. Then she called her supervisor, who called his supervisor, who called the Defense Council, who called the president. By dawn, every world in human space knew. Parents whose children attended Avenir were waking up to messages they could not yet believe. News feeds across 200 colonies broke the story at the same hour. Footage from the colony's surviving cameras showed empty hallways, open dormitory doors, small shoes left behind in the rush. The number was repeated again and again. 416. 416 children, ages 6 to 14. All taken, all gone. In the city of Geneva on Earth, Ambassador Iris Calder stood in her kitchen with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched. She was watching the wall screen. Her assistant had called her at 4:30 in the morning. She had not slept since. Her hands were steady, but her face had gone very pale. She was a woman who had spent 30 years arguing for diplomacy. She had written papers on the moral cost of retaliation. She had once given a speech to the Concord of Worlds about the value of patience. She remembered every word of that speech now, and the words felt like ash in her mouth. In a hidden facility above the orbit of Jupiter, an old admiral named Torin Vey received the news in his private quarters. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to his desk, and opened a drawer he had not opened in 11 years. Inside the drawer was a folder marked with a single black seal. He picked up the folder. He carried it to the command deck. He set it down on the table in front of his senior officers and said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said, very quietly, that the time had come. In a small apartment on the colony of New Lagos, a mother named Adiz sat on the floor of her daughter's empty bedroom. Her daughter, Lena, was 7 years old. She had a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Bompo that she had left on the bed at Avenir because she had wanted to pack light. Adiz held the rabbit. She did not cry. She had not yet found a way to start. The galaxy waited. It had watched humanity for 300 years and had decided what humanity was. Soft, patient, kind. The galaxy expected statements, protests, demands, appeals to the Concord. The galaxy expected what it had always seen. The galaxy was about to learn it had been wrong. Rain fell on the glass dome of the Concord chamber. It always rained on the world of Velis, where the 17 species of the Alliance gathered to argue and vote and pretend they liked each other. The dome was 3 kilometers wide and 900 years old. The rain had been falling on it for every one of those years. Inside the chamber, the seats were full. Every species had sent its delegation. Word of what had happened on Avenir had spread through the Alliance in a single day, and now the great hall hummed with low conversation in 12 languages. Some of the species were curious. Some were worried. A few were quietly amused. Humans had always been the soft ones. The mediators. The species that gave long speeches about peace. Now their children were gone, and the galaxy wanted to see what the soft species would do. Iris Calder walked to the central podium. She wore a plain dark suit. She carried no notes. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her face look older than it was. She set her hands on the podium and looked across the chamber at the Drathan delegation. The Drathans sat in the eastern arc of the hall. Their skin was thick and gray, their faces broad and flat, their eyes set deep under heavy brows. Warden Prime Sevek sat at the front of his delegation with his arms folded. He was smiling. It was a small smile, the kind a man makes when he believes he has already won. Iris began to speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She laid out the facts in order, one by one, the way a doctor might describe an illness to a patient. The freighter, the forged supply code, the 40 soldiers, the 3 murdered teachers, the 416 children, the route the freighter had taken into Drathan space. The intelligence reports that placed the children, alive, on the Drathan homeworld of Threth. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Even the rain on the dome seemed to fade for a moment. Sevek stood up. He spoke in the trade tongue, slowly, the way a man speaks to a child he is about to teach a hard lesson. He did not deny the abduction. He did not pretend the Drathan were innocent. He said the Drathan hegemony had taken the children as a matter of policy. He said the children would be returned safely if the human worlds agreed to certain territorial adjustments. He named the adjustments. They were large. They included 3 productive systems and a major shipping lane. He said the Drathan had no wish for war. He said humans had never wanted war either, and that this was simply a negotiation conducted by other means. He sat down. He was still smiling. Iris waited. She waited long enough that the chamber began to grow uncomfortable. Then she spoke again. She said that humanity rejected the Drathan offer. She said humanity rejected the framing of the offer. She said humanity rejected the idea that the lives of children could be used as items in a territorial bargain. Then she said the words that would be remembered for a long time afterward. She said that humanity invoked the 8th article of the Concord Charter. A sound moved through the chamber. It was not loud. It was the sound of 17 species drawing breath at the same time. The 8th article had been written into the founding charter 900 years ago. It had never been used. It permitted unrestricted military action by an injured member species when another member species committed crimes against children. It suspended the normal rules of war. It removed the requirement for proportional response. It was, in plain language, the article that permitted a species to do whatever it judged necessary. Sevek stopped smiling. He stood up again. He began to argue. He said the 8th article required a vote of the chamber. He said no such vote had been held. He said humanity could not invoke the article without the support of at least 3 other species. Iris turned to the chamber and asked who would speak. For a long moment no one moved. The species of the Concord were old and cautious. They did not like to take sides. They had survived for centuries by staying neutral and letting other races burn themselves out. Then Speaker Olin rose. Olin was the eldest member of the chamber. His species, the Henner, were small and gray and lived for nearly 400 years each. Olin was 351. He had served in the chamber for 200 years. He had voted against war every single time the question had come before him. He walked slowly to the central floor. His robes were plain. His voice was thin, but it carried. He said that he had spent his life believing that peace was the highest law. He said he still believed it. Then he said that peace built on the silence of stolen children was not peace. It was something else, something worse, and he would not lend his name to it. He cast his support behind humanity. 2 more species followed within the hour. The Vesh, a quiet trading people who had never voted on a war in their entire history. The Karen, who had lost their own children to slavers 9 centuries ago and had never forgotten. The 8th article was invoked. Sevek sat very still. His delegation said nothing. The smile was gone now. He had made a calculation, weeks ago, in a council room on Threth. He had calculated that humans would never retaliate with force. He had calculated that the soft species would fold. He understood, in the silence of the chamber, that he had calculated wrong. Iris Calder gathered her papers. She walked back to her seat. She did not look at Sevek as she passed. Outside the dome, the rain kept falling. Far from the reign of Velis and the speeches of ambassadors, in the long shadow of Jupiter, where sunlight grew thin and weak, something began to wake. It had been sleeping for 41 years. The hidden shipyard was a structure that did not exist on any map. It was built into the dark side of a small captured asteroid that orbited Jupiter at a strange angle, hidden by the giant planet's own magnetic noise. The asteroid was called Object 7 in the few classified documents that mentioned it at all. Most of those documents had been destroyed long ago. The men and women who had built the shipyard had been retired with full pensions and signed agreements they could never break. Inside Object 7, 300 warships floated in long parallel rows. Their hulls were dark, painted in a coating that absorbed almost every form of scanning light. Their weapons were folded into recessed bays. Their engines were cold. They looked, in the dim light of the dock lamps, like a forest of sleeping things. Admiral Torin Vey stood on the observation platform and looked down at the fleet he had spent half his life pretending did not exist. He was 74 years old. He had a stiff right knee and a scar on his jaw that he had earned in a small war nobody wrote books about. He had argued, every year for 41 years, that this fleet should be melted down for scrap. He had argued that humanity should never build a thing it did not intend to use. He had been overruled, every year, by the same quiet committee. He was glad now that he had been overruled. He was also grieving, because being glad about a thing like this felt like the death of something inside him. He gave the order. The ships began to wake one at a time. Reactor cores warmed. Engines flared blue and white. Crews boarded through long umbilical tubes. Men and women who had been called from quiet civilian lives across 200 colonies. They had all signed the same agreement, decades ago. They had all known that one day the call might come. The call had come. On the bridge of the cruiser Resolute, Captain Ronan Hale read his orders for the 3rd time. He was a tall man, lean and gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of a person who had spent his career hoping he would never be needed. He had served in the Earth Defense Fleet for 22 years. He had argued, in 8 separate hearings before the Defense Council, against the expansion of human military capacity. He had said that fleets, once built, demanded to be used. He had said that humanity should not become the thing it claimed to oppose. He folded the orders and slid them into his coat pocket. He walked to the forward viewport. He looked at the dark hulls of the ships forming up around the Resolute. He thought about his daughter, who was 19 and studying xenobiology on a colony 3 jumps away. He thought about the 416 children on Threth, in cells, frightened, waiting. He gave his first order. The fleet began to move. Lieutenant Daria Voss arrived on the Resolute 8 hours later, carried in by a fast courier from the intelligence headquarters on Earth. She was small and dark-eyed and very tired. She had not slept in 3 days. She walked onto the bridge with a data slate clutched to her chest and a look on her face that made the crew step out of her way. She placed the slate on the command table. She brought up the map. The compound on Threth was buried inside a mountain in the northern continent. It was guarded by 2 divisions of Drathan ground troops and a planetary defense grid. The children were being held in a sub-level facility beneath the main compound. The intelligence had cost the lives of 3 human operatives and 1 Drathan defector. It was solid. It was confirmed. The children were alive. Ronan studied the map for a long time. He asked questions. Daria answered them. He asked more questions. Daria answered those two. By the end of the briefing, the senior officers around the table had stopped speaking entirely. They were beginning to understand the shape of what was being asked of them. This was not going to be a war. Wars had rules. Wars had front lines and supply chains and slow grinding battles between matched fleets. This was going to be something else. This was going to be a strike, sudden and total, against a power that thought itself safe. Ronan looked up from the map. He said the fleet would jump in 3 hours. He said the Drathan would have no warning. He said human ships would not fire on civilian targets, would not target food production, would not strike at hospitals or schools. He said the rules of the strike would be clear and the rules would not be broken. Then he said something else. He said that any Drathan warship, military installation, or planetary defense platform that stood between the fleet and the children at Threth would be destroyed without negotiation, without warning, and without hesitation. The room was very quiet. Daria nodded once. She picked up her slate. She walked to the door of the briefing room and stopped before going through it. She turned back and looked at Ronan. She said the children had been in those cells for 19 days now. She said the youngest child, a girl named Lena, was 7 years old. Ronan said he knew. Daria nodded again and walked out. In the long dark of Object 7, the last of the 300 ships finished its warm-up sequence. The fleet moved in formation toward the jump point. The lights on the asteroid dock began, one by one, to go out. 41 years of silence ended. The reckoning was coming. The Drathan outer defense officer on duty that morning was named Vestal. He was 40 years old, halfway through a long and unremarkable career, and he was halfway through his second cup of bitterroot tea when the proximity alarms began to scream. He looked up at his console. He blinked twice. He looked again. The numbers did not change. 300 warships had appeared at the edge of the system. They had come out of jump in perfect formation, with the kind of precision that took decades of training and a level of fleet coordination the Drathan had not seen in living memory. They were already moving. They were already firing. Vestal reached for the alert switch with a hand that had begun to shake. The first wave hit the outer defense platforms before the Drathan command could even confirm what was happening. The platforms had been built 2 centuries ago and upgraded only twice since. Their crews had grown soft on long, quiet shifts. They fired back, of course. They did what they had been trained to do. But the human ships moved in patterns the Drathan targeting computers had never been calibrated against, and the human weapons cut through armor that had not been redesigned in 70 years. Within 4 hours, the outer defense ring of the Drathan hegemony was gone. Warden Prime Sevek received the news in his command bunker on Threth. He had returned home from Velis only 3 days earlier. He had told his council that the human response would be slow, diplomatic, full of speeches and sanctions. He had said it would take humans 6 months to even decide what to do. He had been very confident. He stood now in front of the holographic battle map and watched the icons of his outer fleet wink out one by one. His jaw worked. His hands closed into fists. He gave the order to recall the inner fleet to defensive positions around Drath Veshel, the largest colony world of the hegemony. He believed he could still hold a line there. He believed humans, for all their fury, would not commit fully to a war so far from home. He was wrong about that too. The human fleet did not pause to consolidate its gains. It did not stop to declare victories or issue demands. It moved straight through the gap in the outer defenses and pushed deeper into Drathan space. Captain Ronan Hale, on the bridge of the Resolute, kept his orders simple. The fleet would not slow. The fleet would not deviate. Every Drathan warship that stood in the path would be removed from the path. Every defense platform that fired on human ships would be silenced. The fleet was going to Threth, and nothing in the universe was going to make it stop short of Threth. Above Drath Veshel, the inner fleet of the Drathan hegemony assembled itself for what its commanders believed would be the great battle of the war. The battle lasted 3 days. On the first day, the Drathan fleet committed itself to a wide engagement, trusting in numbers and the home advantage. The human fleet absorbed the first wave and answered with a maneuver the Drathan had never seen, a coordinated split and flank that broke the Drathan line into 3 isolated segments. By nightfall on the planet below, the Drathan had lost a quarter of their inner fleet. On the second day, Drathan reserves arrived from the inner systems. They committed to a heavy push against the human flank. The push held for 6 hours. Then it broke, and when it broke fully, ships venting atmosphere and crews abandoning their posts and command channels falling silent one after another. By the second nightfall, half the Drathan inner fleet was destroyed or disabled. On the third day, the surviving Drathan ships tried to surrender. Captain Hale accepted some of the surrenders. He did not accept others. The ones he did not accept were the ships that had been part of the Avenir abduction, the freighters and escorts whose transponder records were already in human intelligence files. Those ships were boarded. Their crews were taken into custody. Their captains were placed under arrest under Concord law for crimes against children. Those captains and their crews would face trial. They would not face it from positions of power. By the end of the third day, the space above Drath vessel belonged to the human fleet. Sevek watched the reports come in from his bunker on Threth. His council members had gone silent. Some had fled. The emergency communications from the colony worlds were arriving in waves, demanding orders, demanding rescue, demanding answers. He had no answers. He stood in front of the battle map for a long time, watching the icons of his fleet vanish one after another, and he understood at last what he had done. He had not started a war. Wars were things between equals. Wars had rules and states and treaties. He had made an enemy of a species that had spent 40 years quietly preparing for exactly this moment, and had spent 3 centuries before that hoping it would never come. He thought about the children in the compound below his feet. He thought about the calculation he had made, the smug certainty that humans would fold. He thought about the smile he had worn in the chamber on Velis. He felt, for the first time in his adult life, something very close to fear. Above the planet, sensors detected the leading edge of the human fleet entering the system. Sevek turned to his aide. He gave an order. The aide hesitated. Sevek repeated the order, louder this time. The aide nodded and ran from the room. In the holding cells beneath the compound, 416 children were about to discover that someone had come for them. The drop pods came down through the Threth atmosphere in a long line of fire. They burned across the morning sky like falling stars, and the people in the city below who saw them knew, in some quiet part of themselves, that the war had come home. Lieutenant Daria Voss was in the third pod from the front. She had her helmet on. She was breathing slowly, the way she had been trained to breathe, in for 4 counts, out for 6. Her hands rested on the harness straps. The pod shook around her. The heat shield glowed white. None of it touched her. Her mind was already inside the compound, walking the routes she had memorized from intelligence maps for 19 days. The pods landed in a wide circle around the mountain compound. The doors blew open. 200 human soldiers came out moving at a hard run, splitting into the formations they had drilled for weeks aboard the troop carriers. Daria took her squad to the eastern entrance, the one the Drathan had not bothered to fortify because the cliff face there was too steep to climb. The cliff face was indeed too steep to climb. Her squad did not climb it. They blew a hole through it. Inside the compound, the Drathan guards had been waiting for orders that had not come. Sevek's command structure had collapsed in the last 6 hours. Some guards fought. Many surrendered. A few, when they understood who the soldiers were and what had brought them here, simply put down their weapons and stepped away from the doors. They had families of their own. They had not chosen this assignment. They had not been told what was in the lower levels. They had been told only that there were prisoners, and the prisoners were valuable. Daria moved through the upper levels with her squad, room by room. She found records. She found supply rooms. She found a guard barracks where the guards had already fled. She found offices where Drathan officers had been burning documents, the smoke still rising from metal bins. She found one officer who tried to fire a sidearm at her. She did not fire back. The soldier behind her did, and the matter ended. She reached the holding wing in the 3rd hour of the assault. The corridor was long and gray and lit by yellow ceiling lights that flickered in a slow, uneven rhythm. The cell doors were heavy and metal. There were 40 cells on each side of the corridor. Daria's squad spread out and began to open them. The children inside were quiet at first. They had learned, during the 19 days, that noise brought bad things. They sat on the thin pads that served as beds, or stood in the corners, and watched the doors open with the careful eyes of small animals that had learned to expect predators. Then one of them, a boy of about 10, saw the patch on Daria's shoulder. The patch was the flag of the Earth Defense Fleet. He had a poster of that flag in his bedroom on the colony of Hesperin. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he started to cry. After that, the dam broke. Children came out of the cells crying or running or both. Some of them clung to the soldiers. Some of them sat down on the corridor floor and could not move. The soldiers, men and women who had trained for combat, found themselves kneeling in the corridor with children in their arms and tears on their own faces. Daria moved through the cells one at a time, checking. She had a list. She had memorized the list. She found most of the children where the records had said they would be. She did not find the youngest, Lena, in the cells. She walked the corridor twice. She checked the empty cells. She checked the storage rooms. She checked the small medical bay at the end of the hall. Lena was not there. The records had said Lena was on this level. The records had said she was in cell 31. Cell 31 was empty. Daria stood in the empty cell and made herself think. Lena was 7. Lena had been the youngest taken from Avenir. Lena, according to the teacher's surviving statements, was a child who hid when she was afraid. She had hidden under her bed during a thunderstorm once. She had hidden in a closet during a fire drill. She was a hider. Daria walked back into the corridor. She looked at the cleaning closets. She looked at the maintenance hatches. She found Lena in a supply closet behind the medical bay, curled under a low shelf, hidden behind a stack of folded blankets. The closet was dark. Lena had pulled a blanket over herself. She was very small. She was very still. Daria knelt down. She took her helmet off so the child could see her face. She spoke very softly. She said her name. She said she was a soldier from Earth. She said it was over now. Lena did not move at first. Then, slowly, the child reached out one small hand and touched Daria's glove, as if to check whether she was real. Daria lifted Lena out of the closet. The child weighed almost nothing. Daria carried her down the corridor, past the open cells and the crying children and the kneeling soldiers, out through the broken doorway, into the morning light of Threth. Above the planet, Captain Hale received the signal from the surface. Every child accounted for. Every child alive. He closed his eyes for a moment. He had not realized, until that moment, how much he had been holding in his chest. He gave the order. The fleet stood down its weapons. In his bunker beneath the mountain, Warden Prime Sevek was found by human soldiers an hour later. He did not resist arrest. He had nothing left to say. The footage of Daria carrying Lena out of the compound traveled across the galaxy within a day. The 17 species of the Concord watched it. They watched it many times. They understood, finally, what humans were. 6 weeks later, the rain still fell on the dome of the Concord chamber. It always rained on Velis. It would rain there long after every person in the chamber that day had been forgotten. Iris Calder walked back to the central podium for the second time in her life. She wore the same dark suit she had worn before. Her hair was the same. Her hands were the same. Almost nothing about her looked different. Almost. The chamber was full again. Every species had come. The Drathan seats were empty. Iris set her hands on the podium. She did not look across at the empty Drathan arc. She looked at the chamber itself, at the 17 banners hanging from the high curve of the dome, and she began to speak. She read the resolution. The Drathan hegemony, by unanimous vote of the remaining 16 species, was dissolved as a member of the Concord of Worlds. Its territory would be administered by a temporary council of 3 neighboring species until new governments could be formed by the Drathan people themselves. The leadership that had ordered the abduction at Avenir would face trial under Concord law. Warden Prime Sevek and 46 other senior officers were already in custody. Their trials would begin within the year. A new article was being added to the charter. It was being called the Avenir Article. It established protections for the children of all member species, regardless of where they were and which species held them. It granted any injured species the legal right to act under the 8th Article without delay or vote when the lives of children were at stake. The vote was called. The vote passed. Iris stepped down from the podium. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel proud. She walked back to her seat with the same steady pace she had walked with on the day she had first invoked the 8th Article, and she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. Speaker Olin came to find her later, after the chamber had emptied. He was very old. He moved slowly. He sat down beside her in the empty hall, and they listened together for a long time to the rain on the dome. He said the stars were quieter now. She nodded. He said quiet was not the same as peace. He said peace was a thing built between equals who chose, every day, to keep building it. Quiet was different. Quiet was what a galaxy sounded like when it had learned to be afraid of something. She nodded again. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said he had voted for war for the first time in his 351 years of life, and that he would carry the weight of that vote with him until he died. He said he did not regret the vote. He said the regret was a different thing from the vote. She told him she understood. They sat together until the lights of the chamber began to dim. In the months that followed, the 416 children of Avenir went home. Some of them went back to school. Some of them did not. Some of them grew up into ordinary adults with ordinary lives. Some of them did not. Lena, the 7-year-old who had hidden in the supply closet, went home to her mother on new Legos. She slept in her own bed again. She held her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Bompo, who had been waiting for her. For a long time afterward, she would not sleep with the door closed. Her mother understood. The door stayed open. Years later, Lena would become a teacher. She would teach small children, the same age she had been when she was taken. She would never speak much about Avenir, but the children she taught would remember her as the kindest teacher they had ever known. She would live to be very old. She would die in her own bed, surrounded by her own grandchildren, and the rabbit named Mr. Bompo would still be on the shelf above her, his fur worn nearly bald with the love of 3 generations. Captain Ronan Hale retired from the defense fleet 2 years after the war. He went home to a small house on the coast of Maine, on Earth, and he grew tomatoes in a garden behind the house. And he did not speak of the war except to his daughter, once, on a quiet evening when she asked him directly. Lieutenant Daria Voss stayed in the service. She rose through the ranks. She became, eventually, the head of the Concorde's new Child Protection Division, a body whose mandate she had helped to write. She kept on her desk a small framed photograph of the corridor at the compound, the morning the cells were opened. She looked at it, sometimes, when she had hard decisions to make. Admiral Torin Vey lived another 11 years. He died peacefully. He never told anyone, not even his wife, about the night Object 7 had gone dark and the fleet had moved. The galaxy changed. It did not change all at once. The change was slow, the way real changes are. But every species that had sat in the chamber that day remembered what they had seen, and what they had voted on, and what humanity had done to recover its children. The old comfortable assumption that humans were the soft species, the patient ones, the ones who would always choose words over weapons, was gone forever. In its place was a different understanding. Humans chose peace because they had measured the cost of the alternative. They had measured it carefully. They knew what it would cost the galaxy if they ever had to choose again. They knew what it would cost them. They hoped, all of them, that the lesson would hold. For a very long time afterward, it did. Outside the dome on Velis, the rain kept falling.